In the last video, we took a step back and looked at errors and how we can use them to help better understand and debug our code. In the next few videos, we're going to take a more in-depth look at the built-in data types that Python has to offer, and in this video, we're going to start that off with strings. Before we take a look at new things, we're going to review what we already know about strings because we did go over them when we talked about the built-in data types in Python. So as we know right now, strings can either be started with double quotes or single quotes, but they have to match at the beginning and the end. So I'm going to go ahead and declare a variable called message, and I'm going to use double quotes and set that equal to learning Python is fun, if I could type. Now this right here is called a string literal, and this is because we specifically declared this variable as a string value. An example of what a string literal isn't is maybe using the input function, so a variable that is equal to a string, but the string is not explicitly written in the code. And I'm going to go ahead and print off this message variable here because we will be using this variable as a template for everything that we will be doing with strings later on in this video. So like I already mentioned, this is completely fine if we leave it as double quotes, or I can change these to single quotes, and you will see that my editor will throw an error here because it is technically unterminated since the quotations aren't matching at the beginning and the end. So if I set that equal to single quotes, then there's no errors anymore and we can execute this code just fine. And you'll see that learning Python is fun is outputted in the console. Besides single line strings, we also have multi-line strings, and this is denoted in Python by using 3 single or double quotes at the beginning and end of a string. So if I wanted to turn our message into a multi-line string, I can go ahead and remove this, and I'll do this with single quotes now. If I just type in 3, you'll notice that my editor will automatically complete this, and I can go ahead and say over maybe the span of 3 lines, I could say, learning Python is fun. And if I go ahead and save this and output this to the console, you'll see that we get our learning Python is fun on 3 separate lines. Multi-line strings will also keep the formatting, so if I wanted to maybe tab this in, add an extra line in here, and then add an extra line at the end, it might be a little hard to see that extra line at the end, but you can see that our formatting is actually kept with the tabs and the new lines. The multi-line string is very similar to the multi-line comment in Python. And if I want to write a multi-line comment at the top of our file here, I could do the exact same thing as declaring a multi-line string. So I can do 3 quotes and then maybe say, this script teaches different features of strings. And that is a multi-line comment. And if I just go back to having our normal learning Python is fun, and I output this, I can prove that this is in fact not interpreted because we do not have any errors and our output is exactly what we would expect it to be. We're going to go ahead and talk about the first important function that we can use with strings, and this function will return the length of a string. So if I wanted to see what the length of our message here was, I can actually use the len function, and this is just short for length, and this will return an integer because the size of a string or the amount of characters in a string will always be a whole number, and this number will never be less than 0. So if you have an empty string, then the length is going to be 0. So if I go ahead and run this, you can see that it outputs 23, and that's because there are 23 characters inside of the string. It's also important to note that if you have spaces or special characters, those are also counted as characters. So I can add another space here, and I can add another exclamation point there. And if I run that, then we now have 25 characters inside of the string. Just to show that anytime we have an empty string that it returns a 0, we can print the output, and you'll see that the length of our message is now 0 because there are no characters inside. I'm going to go ahead and undo that and bring back our message, and I will fix this to make it normal again. Imagine that maybe we have a Python script that asks a user for their first name and their last name, and then we want to maybe print a message out that says their full name along with a customized message. Well, we're going to need to find a way to be able to combine those two strings to make the first and the last name one combined name. We can actually do that with this thing called string concatenation. I'm going to go ahead and declare in here a first name, and I'm going to set that equal to an input with the message first name in there. And then I am going to copy and make one for the last name here. And then we can actually go ahead and make our full name variable here equal to the first name and the last name combined. So we can do that by using the addition operator. So we already know that if you use the plus sign, then that will add two numbers together. But if you have two strings on either side of the plus sign, then it will actually concatenate them together. So I can go ahead and set the full name equal to the first name plus the last name. And if I want to go ahead and print this out to the console, we can go ahead and see what the output is. Right off the bat, I'm going to go ahead and enter John for the first name and Doe for the last name. And you'll see that the two strings were combined, but there isn't a space in between. So we actually need to manually insert a space anytime we want there to be, well, space in between two strings. So I can go ahead and add a space in here, and then I actually have to concatenate that with those two strings. And if I go ahead and run this and I type in John, oops, let's get down into here. Type in John and then Doe, you'll see that now we have a space. Let's say now we actually want to maybe have a line under the name, but we want this line to be dynamic to however long the name is. Well, we can actually use another mode of concatenation, and that is with the multiplication symbol or the asterisk. So if we wanted to do this under our print statement, we can actually combine what we already know about the length function of a string to create a completely dynamic underline to a name. So if I want to go ahead and print this out, normally someone would probably just go under and maybe add a bunch of dashes and hope that the name is shorter than the amount of dashes there are. If we run that and we see if I put in John Doe once again, John Doe, then we have a whole bunch of lines here, and it does serve what we want it to, but it's a little longer than our name, and we could have a name such as Johnny Appleseed that might be much longer than John Doe. So we can actually use the asterisk to tell it how many times we want to output. So if we use the asterisk here, and let's say that I want to do 10 times, and I'm going to go ahead and hard code these values in just for the sake of this example, because I don't want to have to type it in every time. So we have our first name and our last name is John Doe, and I'll run that, and you'll see that, okay, 10 is a little closer to where we want to be, but we want this to be completely dynamic. So what we can actually do is we can multiply this by the amount of characters that there are in the string. So I can actually say that we want to have as many dashes as the length. So if I run that, you'll see that this is completely flush with our string. If I go ahead and make this Johnny Appleseed and run that, you'll see that it is completely scaled up to his name as well. Let's say that maybe for some reason you want to be able to access a specific character inside of a string. Obviously, since we have a string literal up here, we know what the value of our string is. But maybe if you want to, let's say, create a username for a user if they put in their first and their last name, maybe we want to be able to take the first initial of both of their names. Well, we'll actually want to be able to tell it that we want to take the first character from a string. We can actually do this by using the square brackets next to either the string or the variable that you have, and then tell it what character number or what position in the string that we want to access. So let's say that we want to take the L, because that is the first character, and output that to the console. Well, we could go ahead and put L or 1 in for the first index, and let's go ahead and see what happens. You'll see that rather than L, we actually have the E outputted, and that's because indexing in Python starts with with 0. And this is not a very uncommon thing at all. Most other programming languages start indexing at 0. So this is just a good habit to get used to because chances are you'll probably use this elsewhere. If we go ahead and use 0 in there and save and run this, you'll see that now we finally have our L outputted. Similarly, let's say that we want to be able to output the last character inside of our string. We could always say, okay, well, we want to take the length of our string, and then we remember that since indexing is starting at 0, that we need to subtract 1 to get the last character. We can run that and you'll see that we will get the exclamation point, but there is actually an easier way to do this in Python, and we can get rid of all of this length here and just start indexing at -1. And if we run that, we'll see that we get the same output. So if you want to go from front to back, you will start at 0. So if we wanted to get the A out, that is the third character, but we will have to put in 2 there and we'll get the A. But let's say that we want to get the N, the second to last character. We actually start indexing backwards at -1 because there is no -0. And then if we want the second to last character, then we can do -2. And we can run that and we will get the N, the second to last character in the string. We can also take words out of strings or substrings by using something called string slicing. This is very similar to string indexing and it actually uses a lot of the same concepts. So let's say that we wanted to take the word Python out of the string and output that to the console. Well, we can go ahead and start counting to see what index the P is at because we need to know. So it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10, but subtract 1, that's 9. So that's where that's where the P is. And if we output that, we can prove that that is the P in Python. So now we want to go to the end of Python and output that. So this is 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And let's go ahead and say, okay, 15, but we want to subtract 1. So to actually slice, we use the colon, and then I'll go ahead and put 14 in there. So now the way that this indexing syntax works is it's going to take the start index and the end index, and we'll go ahead and run that, and you might be surprised to see that we actually don't get Python outputted. And the reason for this is because the way that indexing works and slicing works in Python, it's a little strange. The first index that you input will always be inclusive. It will always be the starting index of wherever you want to start, but the index that you want to end at is oddly enough exclusive. So we need to go 1 past the index. So since we all said that the N is at index 14, and just to prove that, we can print this out, and that should output the N once I save and run this. And you'll see that this is the N in the Python. And I'm going to go ahead and put the 9 back. But we actually need to go 1 more at 15 because it's exclusive, and we run that and we are outputted Python to the console. Let's say that maybe we wanted to output everything up to the word Python. We could always type in 0 up to 15, and that will give us learning Python. But there's actually a shorthand that you can use, and that is if you plan to start indexing at the beginning of the string, then the 0 is implied and you do not have to put a 0 there. So I can leave that blank and just have :15. And if I run that, I still have learning Python. But if I obviously want to start at the E and I put the 1 in, then we get earning Python. Now let's say that I want to take everything from Python to the end of the string. So if I wanted to output Python is fun, I could, like I said, take the length of our string and then subtract 1, or I could even just put -1 here and run that, and we will get Python is fun, except for the exclamation point, because like I said, it is exclusive. So we will actually have to take the length of message and then output that, and we will get Python is fun. But there is, once again, an easier way, and you can actually just leave the second half blank as well. And this will imply the very last character in the string if you do not put anything there. So I can run that, and you will now see that we have Python is fun. Let's say that we wanted to get every other character in our string Python is fun. So we're taking the substring Python is fun using our slicing notation here, and we want to get every other character. Well, if we go ahead and run this, you'll see that we have our Python is everything outputted to the console. But to do this, we can actually put another colon. To do this, we can actually put another colon inside of our square brackets, and then we put the amount of steps or the step size that we want to do. So by default, this is set to 1, and you never actually have to explicitly specify this if you just want to get the substring like we've been doing. And if I run this, we have the exact same output. But let's say I want to get every other character, that I'm actually going to put in a step size of 2, and this will give us PTO space SFN, and that's because it's starting where we wanted it to, and it's giving us this one, skipping, giving, skipping, and so on all the way until the end of the string. Using string slicing and our step size, we can actually reverse strings in Python pretty easily. If we go ahead and let's say that we want to reverse this entire message, learning Python is fun, we can use our shorthands along with a step size to be able to reverse the string. So maybe give it a guess and see how you would try and reverse this. If you tried it and you didn't know, then how you would do that is you would first want to select the entire string, and we can do that by simply just putting in a colon, because this will assume the first index all the way until the last index. And you might see this in some code. This is a very easy way to copy strings over to another variable. But anyways, to reverse it, now we need to select our step size. So we're going to put another colon here. And then rather than going as by a step size of 1 from left to right, because we do want it to be a step size of 1, we actually want it to go from right to left. And to do that, we're going to use a -1 here to say that we want to start from the end and actually go backward. If I go ahead and run this, you'll see that our string is backwards. We can also do every other character backwards by putting in a -2, and you'll see that now we have a really weird message outputted, and you can do some pretty weird things with strings by reversing them and using step sizes or selecting substrings from them to get some pretty weird results. We're now going to go ahead and talk about string formatting, which is a pretty big feature of strings in Python, and there are 3 main ways to do this, and we're going to talk about all 3 of them today in this video. The first way, and the easiest way in my opinion, is using something called an F string. So let's say that I want to maybe change our message to say, rather than Python is fun, maybe I want to make it say Java is hard. Now obviously we could just go ahead and change it because we are using a string literal here, but maybe we want to make a Mad Libs-esque program and have them maybe input the programming language, which I'll go ahead and do, and I will set that equal to input, and I will say enter a programming language. And then I will have another variable called adjective, and I will have this set to the input function and say enter an adjective. And then our message will actually be the result of whatever programming language and whatever adjective they chose. So to do this, and if we use the F string way, simply put, the F string is called this because it is a string with an F in front of it, and you can see that my editor automatically highlights this F because it knows that it is being used as an F string. Now, to be able to put these values inside of the string, this is called string interpolation, when you replace values inside of a string with other string values. I can actually go ahead and surround this wherever I want this word to go with curly braces, and I'm going to put the name of the variable that I want to go inside of here. So I want the programming language to go in the spot of the first word, and then where fun is, I want that to be the adjective. So I'm going to use curly braces again, and I will put the adjective inside of there. And then if we go ahead and run this and say, okay, let's put in a programming language. Let's do Java. And then let's say that Java is fun, because Java is fun. Then you'll see that our output is learning Java is fun. You should keep in mind that you can't actually use f-strings if you're using a version of Python before 3.6, because f-strings were introduced in Python 3.6 and they work with any version above that, obviously. Rather than using f strings, we can also use the format function or the dot format. So with this, we can go ahead and get rid of our variables here, and we can use the dot format function. And you'll know that this will work after any string. So to be able to use the dot format function, we actually can do this a few ways as well. Similar to the f string, we can use the curly braces inside of the string wherever we want to go, but we don't actually have to specify the variable name inside of here because it's not going to know what we're talking about. So to use the format function, we actually have to enter the values that we want to put in here in sequential order by comma separated list. So to do this inside of the format function, we are just going to pass it the name of the variables that we want to use. So the first one that we want to use is the programming language. So I can just pass that in and then use a comma and give it the adjective. And if we go ahead and run that, you will see that maybe this time I want to put C++. And I want to say C++ is hard, then our new message is learning C++ is hard. We can also give these placeholders aliases. So maybe we want to say for the person reading the code, because they're not going to know what's supposed to go inside of the string, maybe we want to leave them a little hint and put an alias inside of there. Well, we know that the first one is going to be a programming language of some sort. So maybe what I'll do is I will call this alias lang, just because it's short for language. And then the second one will still be adjective, or yeah, we'll leave it as adjective. And then inside of here, we can actually say, well, the lang is equal to the programming language. So we're actually saying that this lang here needs to be the value in the programming language, and then adjective here needs to be the adjective up here. And if we go ahead and run this, and we'll just stick with our C++ is hard, we get the exact same output. But that does mean, since we're doing it this way, we can actually switch the order of these variables here, and it's not going to matter. So if I go ahead and say that we want to do the adjective first and then the language second, and run it, and this time I'll say C and hard, then we still get learning C is hard, because it doesn't matter what order we put these in. As long as we're setting them to the right aliases, then it won't matter. Rather than using aliases, we can also use indices, similar to how we do that with indexing strings. So let's say that inside of here, maybe we want to keep the order of the adjective goes first and then the programming language goes second for some reason. Well, we can actually get rid of these aliases in here, and since we're doing that, that means that we can't actually use them inside of the format function. But now if we run this, since it's in sequential order, then if we put in Java and hard, then we'll actually see learning hard is Java, and that's because it is in sequential order. But let's say that we wanted to specify in here, maybe you're going to have 3 values. Well, let's say that the first value is a dummy value for some reason, just for the example here. Let's say that we have inside of here, because we can just pass it strings, let's say we'll just have a bunch of nonsense in there. And then we run it, and let's see what happens. Well, we're going to put in C++, and we'll say hard, and it says learning whatever this stuff is hard, and then our programming language is just not there. We can actually say that we want to take the first item or the second item and the third item, and the indexing here is going to start at 0. And if we go ahead and do this and run it, then we say, okay, well, let's say Python this time, and we say fun, then we still get learning fun is Python, and that's because we actually have the adjective here. So if I go ahead and switch these to 2 and 1, that was my mistake, and then run it again, and let's just do Python and fun, then we have learning Python is fun, and this first value here is just completely ignored. But if I wanted to say maybe Python, so our third value, and then let's put this nonsense in here. So I could put 0 here, then this will choose the third item, or sorry, this should be 2 because indexing. Third item, and then first item, and run this, and I will say Python is fun, and we'll now get learning Python is nonsense. I know that was a very strange example, but I'm sure you guys get the point. I'm going to go ahead and remove these two temp variables that we have up here, and then remove this .format function call here and just go back to the way it was. So learning Python is fun, and output this, and you'll see that we have learning Python is fun. We're going to take a look at the final way that you can format strings in Python, and you'll probably see this a lot in legacy Python 2 code, but I'm not sure that many people use that now in Python 3 because of the F string. But this is going to use a weird syntax and things called string format specifiers. So let's say that maybe we want to do what we did last time and put in different values in place for the programming language and the adjective here. Well, to do this using format specifiers, we can actually remove the two words that we want to put in place here. And we're going to use a %, and you'll see that this will automatically highlight orange in my editor, and it'll go with the I here. But we need to put in what type of data type this is going to be. So in our case, we know that this is going to be a string because it's a programming language. So we need to be able to put in a string here. So to do that using a format specifier, we need to do %s. And the S here is pretty easy to remember because it starts with an S, so that means string. Let's say that we also have our adjective. So just like the language, that is going to be %s. But let's say that maybe we want to have a version in here. So we're talking about Python 3 specifically. Well, we're doing Python 3. So I want to be able to put an integer in here. So to do that, we're going to do the %, and in this case, it's going to be a D. And to be able to actually interpolate the values inside of here, we need to go ahead and do another % here. And since we have more than one format specifier, we need to follow it up with parentheses and then use commas to separate what we want to pass in here. So in this case, let's say we have the first one is going to be Python. The second one is going to be 3, and since this is an integer, then we can just use the normal integer. And then the next one is fun. And if we go ahead and print that, now we have learning Python 3 is fun. But let's say we want to go a little further, and rather than just saying Python 3, we want to say Python 3.9 because that's what we're using. So to do that, we can use the specifier for the float, and that is %f. And let's say now we want to put in 3.9 and run it, and let's see what happens. Well, we actually get learning Python 3.9 and then a bunch of zeros afterwards. Well, that's no good if you just want to have Python 3.9. So to be able to tell it how many numbers you want after the decimal, you can actually go in the %f and type in before the f %.2, and that will give you two numbers after the decimal place. So if I go ahead and run this, you'll see that it says learning Python 3.90 is fun. Obviously, it's just Python 3.9, so we want to go one step further and turn that to a 0.1f, and then go ahead and run that, and you will see that now we have learning Python 3.9 is fun. And now we're going to talk about escape characters, and these escape characters will allow us to put things like new lines and tabs in our strings. Now obviously we could use a multi-line comment, but it's important to know about escape characters just because they're there. So let's say that I wanted to put a new line after learning Python 3, then the way to do that is actually using a backslash and an in, and this is somewhat similar to the format specifiers that we talked about. And if we go ahead and run this and output it, then you'll notice that this is outputted on a new line. I can also say let's tab it in at the beginning, and the tab is going to be probably, like you guessed, the \t. And we run that, and now we have a tab in here and a new line. If you plan to write any code that handles with Windows file paths, since Windows is different than Linux, the file path actually uses backslash rather than a / like Linux, because anytime there's a backslash, that's automatically going to try and use an escape character. So we actually need to escape the backslash with another backslash. And you can see that the syntax highlighter will know that we're escaping this, and if we output that, then we actually just get one backslash here. I'm going to go ahead and remove these, and we are going to start talking about the different functions that we can use with strings. Let's say that I want to take our string and split it into the different words inside of it. I can actually use a function called the split function. So I want to go ahead and make a new variable here called words. And I want to take our message and I want to split it. So you'll see that if I do dot split afterwards using this dot notation that we've seen before, I need to actually let it know what I want it to split on, the separator, the delimiter. So in our case, since I want to use words, then we know that words are separated by a space. So if I go ahead and split that, and then rather than outputting our message, I want to output the words variable. And you'll see that this will return a list full of strings. I could have it split on something that isn't a space, so maybe I want to split it on an I, because there is more than one I in this string. So if I go ahead and run this, and you'll see we'll get a little bit weirder looking list, but it does split on the I nonetheless. The opposite of the split function is actually the join function, and this is the opposite. So instead of taking a string, it actually has to take a list. So if I want to go ahead and say that, first let's swap these, and then our words will be a list, and this will be just hello, and then the second one will be world. So I want to turn this into a string. We can actually go ahead and say that our message, rather than this, is going to be a string of some sort, dot join, and then we need to put in a list or a tuple full of strings. Now, if we go ahead and output the message this time and not the words and run this, then you'll see that we have hello world, but it's actually not separated by space. And that's because we told it to join on an empty string. So what we could do is just put a space in there and then run that, and we now have hello world with a space. But we could also say, let's put a dash in there. Then we could just put a dash inside of the first string, and you'll see that the separator is now a string. We can also count the amount of occurrences of a specific character inside of a string using the count function. So if I want to just print the amount of times that we have an I in here, I can just say message.count, and then I need to give it some sort of string that we want to count. So I want to count the amount of lowercase i's, and I can print that, and we will get 2. If I wanted to see how many uppercase i's, I can print that and we'll get 0, and that's because in Python, capital characters are considered to be different than lowercase, so you need to keep that in mind. I can also use a function to replace, let's say, all of the lowercase i's with capital I's, and you can use this with any substring. So I just take our string and I do dot replace using this dot notation. I need to give it the old string, so what I want to replace, and the new string, what I want to replace the old string with. So in our case, let's say that we want to replace the lowercase I with an uppercase I. And if I go ahead and run this, then we now have learning Python is fun, but all of the I's are capitalized. This isn't limited to characters, and in fact, I can actually go ahead and say, let's replace Python with Java. And this totally works with strings, and we can run this and you'll see that learning Java is fun is the new output. Let's say that I wanted to programmatically make every character inside of our string uppercase or lowercase. We can actually do that with pretty useful functions with the dot upper and the dot lower function. So if I wanted to make it all uppercase, I can just follow our string up with dot upper with the parentheses and run that, and now it is learning Python is fun in all caps. I already mentioned that there is a lower function, so we can go ahead and run dot lower, and you'll see that now all of our capital characters are lowercase. There's also another function called the title function, and this will take every first letter of a word and capitalize it, similar to how you would read a book title or a movie title. If I go ahead and insert in some tabs on either side of the string, let's say that maybe a user inputted a string and there was a lot of spacing on either side, we can actually programmatically strip the white space on either side of the string. So the first way to do it off of the left side is to use the lstrip function. So I can just do .lstrip and go ahead and run that, and you'll see that now the white space on the left-hand side of the string is gone. And I know it's hard to see because of the terminal, but this white space on the right side is in fact still there, because if I go ahead and change this L to an R, and use the rstrip function, that will now get rid of all the white space on the right side, and you can see that we still have the white space on the left side. If I wanted to get rid of white space on both sides of the string, then I can just use the strip function, and that will take care of it on both sides, and we are now left with our original output. In this video, we talked a lot about strings, and we went over the different functions that we can use with them, how to index them and gather substrings from them, and how to format them. In the next video, we are going to talk about lists and tuples, which share a lot of similarities with strings.